She stood on those courthouse steps with $47,000 and a broken life, watching her ex-husband mock her in front of strangers. He told her she was nothing, worthless, that her Yale degree meant nothing, that she'd never make it without him. Then a $3 million car pulled up, and when the door opened, her ex-husband's face went white, because the man stepping out wasn't just anyone. He was Damian Sterling, $50 billion, Goldman Sachs' biggest client, and he was there for her. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "are we resolved?" What her ex-husband didn't know was that she'd been working for Sterling for 3 months. What he didn't know was that she was making more money than he ever had. And what he really didn't know was that she was carrying his baby. This is the story of how a woman who lost everything became the person her abuser feared most. How she authenticated $300 million in art while pregnant. How she testified against her ex-husband in federal court. And how she proved that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming so powerful that your past becomes irrelevant. Stay with me, because this story, it's going to show you exactly how she did it. The Houston heat hit Claire Sullivan like a physical thing as she stood on the courthouse steps, clutching divorce papers that still smelled like printer toner. Her Navy Target suit, 3 years old, pressed that morning to shaking hands, clung to her back in the 90-degree humidity. She fumbled with her cracked iPhone screen, trying to order an Uber, but her fingers wouldn't stop trembling. "Claire, sweetheart, still here?" That voice. Mark's voice. The one that used to whisper promises and now only delivered cruelty. Her ex-husband, technically still her husband for another 5 minutes until these papers were filed, descended the courthouse steps like a conquering general. Mark Davidson, 39 years old, vice president at Goldman Sachs, wearing a suit that cost more than Claire's entire month of rent. On his arm, Amber Lee, 25, blonde, pharmaceutical sales rep, wearing head-to-toe Chanel. Claire recognized the bag. She'd pointed it out in a Neiman Marcus window 6 months ago, back when she still thought they were happy, back before she found the hotel receipts. Mark stopped 5 feet away, that trademark smirk spreading across his handsome face. He wanted an audience for this. There were at least a dozen people on the courthouse steps, and Mark had always loved an audience. "Having trouble getting a ride?" He laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. "Oh, that's right. You'll be taking the bus from now on, won't you? That $47,000 settlement should cover a monthly Metro pass, maybe save some for ramen noodles." Amber giggled, clutching his arm tighter. "Mark, stop. You're terrible." No, I'm just being realistic." Mark stepped closer, dropping his voice to that intimate, cruel whisper Claire knew too well. "5 years, Claire. 5 years you spent supporting my career. And what do you have to show for it? Your sister's couch in a storage unit in Katy. You know what the saddest part is? I actually feel bad for you. That fancy Yale degree in art history? Turns out it's worth exactly what I always said it was. Nothing." Claire forced herself to breathe, to not react, to not give him the satisfaction. "You were never going to make it without me," Mark continued, adjusting his $200 Hermes tie. "Those gallery connections in New York, gone. That promising career everyone said you had, dead. You're 34, unemployed, and completely irrelevant. Honestly, I did you a favor. Now you can stop pretending you were ever in my league." The roar of an engine cut through the thick Houston air. Claire looked up, grateful for any distraction. A car was turning the corner onto the street. Not just any car, but a machine that made Mark's brand new BMW 7 Series parked down the street look like a child's toy. Black, matte finish, moving like liquid shadow. A Bugatti Chiron, worth approximately $3.4 million. The car glided to a stop directly in front of Claire. Mark's smirk froze. "What the?" The driver's door opened with a whisper of expensive engineering. A man stepped out. Early 50s, silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin. His face was angular, expressionless, but his eyes were the color of gunmetal. He radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Mark knew that face. Claire could see the recognition dawn in his eyes. followed immediately by dawning horror. It was Damian Sterling, the ghost, the recluse, the tech and logistics billionaire whose company, Sterling Industries, managed assets worth over $50 billion. A man whose Houston office was Goldman Sachs' largest client. Sterling didn't look at Mark. He didn't acknowledge Amber. He walked directly to Claire with the precision of a surgical strike. "Ms. Sullivan," he said quietly. His voice cut through the street noise like a scalpel. "Are we resolved?" Claire looked up. The trembling in her hands had stopped. "Yes, Mr. Sterling, it's finalized." "Good." He glanced at her worn leather portfolio. "Did you review the Caravaggio authentication I sent this morning?" "I have notes." Claire's voice was steady now. "The brushwork on the drapery is inconsistent with his documented technique from 1608 to 1610. I believe it's Artemisia Gentileschi, possibly painted in tribute around 1612. The emotional intensity in the subject's gaze is wrong for Caravaggio. It's too personal, too female-coded in the directional eye contact." Something flickered in Sterling's eyes, not a smile, but close. "Interesting. We'll discuss it on the plane. We have a 3 p.m. departure to Milan. The Uffizi curator is expecting your analysis by Monday." He opened the passenger door. Claire paused. For the first time since Mark had spoken, she turned to look at him to catch him. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't triumphant. It was simply indifferent. The look you'd give a stranger who bumped into you in a crowd. "Goodbye, Mark." She slid into the low-slung leather seat. Sterling closed the door with a soft, expensive clack. He walked back to the driver's side. Only then, for precisely 1 second, did he let his gaze fall on Mark. It wasn't a look of anger, not contempt. It was pure, absolute dismissal. The look a king might give a court jester who just told a bad joke. Then he got in. The engine, which had been purring, growled to life with a deep, thrumming sound of pure power. The Bugatti pulled away, disappearing into Houston traffic. Mark stood frozen, his face chalk white. The smirk was gone, replaced by dawning, sickening horror. Amber tugged his arm, her voice high and confused. "Baby, who was that? How does she know Damian Sterling?" Mark could barely breathe. "That was Damian Sterling. He's Goldman Sachs' largest client. He's worth $50 billion. And she just got into his car like it was nothing." "But I thought you said she was nobody. You said she had no connections, no career, nothing." "Shut up, Amber. Just shut up." Mark pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "I need to call the office. I need to find out what the hell just happened." But deep down, in the place where his ego usually lived, Mark Davidson already knew. He'd underestimated his wife. And in his world, underestimation was a fatal sin. Inside the Bugatti, Claire sat in silence as Sterling navigated Houston traffic with surgical precision. The interior smelled like leather and money. The seats were heated despite the Houston summer. Everything was perfect, controlled, expensive. "You don't have to pretend you're not shaking," Sterling said, not looking away from the road. Claire realized her hands were trembling again. "I'm sorry, that was..." Satisfying, terrifying. "Wait, boy, because now it's real. This job, this opportunity, all of it. I can't wake up and discover it was a dream." That was Damian Sterling's biggest fear, that she'd wake up on Rachel's couch and discover the past 3 months had been a stress-induced hallucination. "It's real, Ms. Sullivan. The car is real, the crib is real, the salary is real, and your ex-husband's face when he realized you were working for me?" Sterling allowed himself the ghost of a smile. That was extremely real. Claire let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. "Thank you for the timing, for showing up when you did." "I didn't show up for theatrical effect," Sterling said. "I showed up because we have a 3 p.m. flight to Milan, and you needed to be extracted from that courthouse. The fact that your ex-husband witnessed it is simply efficient communication." Efficient communication? He now knows 3 things. 1, you are employed by me. 2, you are competent enough to be employed by me. 3, his opinion of your worth is irrelevant to reality. These are facts he needed to learn. Now he has learned them. Claire looked out the window as Houston streamed past. "How did you know? That he'd be there, that he'd say those things?" "I didn't know, but I made an educated guess based on his psychological profile." Men like Mark Davidson don't simply move on. They need to dominate, to have the last word, to ensure their narrative remains unchallenged. He was always going to be at that courthouse. He was always going to mock you. And you were always going to need an exit strategy that demonstrated your value. So this was a lesson for him? No, this was a lesson for you. Sterling glanced at her briefly. You needed to see his face when he realized you were worth something. Not because you need his validation, but because you need to stop believing his lies. The look on his face, that was the truth. You are valuable, you are competent, and you never needed him. Claire felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd cried enough over Mark Davidson. She was done crying. Now, Sterling said, pulling up to her apartment building, you have 2 hours to pack for Milan. We'll be gone for 4 days. Bring your thesis research on Caravaggio. And Miss Sullivan. Sullivan? Yes. Welcome to your new life. 4 months before that courthouse scene, Claire Sullivan had been a different woman. Not worse, not better, just different. She'd been standing in the kitchen of their luxury high-rise condo in downtown Houston, preparing for one of Mark's dinner parties. She'd spent all day cooking, homemade pasta from scratch, a complicated French dessert that required precise temperature control, fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases throughout the apartment. She was good at this, creating beautiful spaces, beautiful meals, beautiful experiences. It was the one thing Mark still complimented her on. The risotto is perfect, Claire, he'd said the week before. You really do have a gift for this. She'd glowed at that compliment for days. During dinner, Mark's phone buzzed on the marble counter. Claire had been loading the dishwasher when she saw it. She picked it up to bring it to him, and the screen lit up with a preview notification. Dr. Peterson with a heart emoji. Can't wait for our appointment tomorrow, baby. Wear that thing I like. The room tilted. There was no Dr. Peterson. Mark's doctor was Dr. Morrison at Methodist Hospital, and Dr. Morrison definitely didn't send heart emojis or ask Mark to wear things. Claire stood there holding the phone, watching the screen fade to black. Her hands were shaking. Her chest felt tight. She couldn't breathe properly. After the guests left, Mark's colleagues from Goldman Sachs, laughing and drunk and oblivious, she confronted him. Who's Dr. Peterson? Mark, loosening his tie, didn't even try to lie convincingly. Fine, yes, her name is Amber. And you want to know the truth? She makes me feel alive. You make me feel managed, like I'm one of your little art projects you're trying to create into something acceptable. I gave up my career in New York for you. I moved here because you said Houston was better for your career. I gave up? Mark exploded, his face turning red. You were making $38,000 a year as a junior curator. I was pulling in bonuses that were 5 times your annual salary. You didn't give up anything. You made a smart trade. And what did I get in return? A wife who spends her days reading books nobody cares about and arranging flowers. Claire felt like she'd been punched in the chest. I edited all your reports. I hosted your clients. I managed our home so you could focus. I needed a partner, Claire, an equal. Instead, I got an assistant, and not even a particularly competent one. He grabbed his keys. I'm staying at the Houstonian tonight. My lawyer will contact you. But he didn't leave, not right away. He stood there looking at her, and something in his expression shifted. Regret, guilt, whatever it was fleeting. Claire, I didn't mean for it to happen like this. She was crying now, silently. Then why did it? He didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward her, and in that moment, that terrible, confused last moment of their marriage, they fell into old patterns. Comfort, familiarity, the muscle memory of 5 years together. They slept together that night, one last time. It wasn't passion. It wasn't makeup sex. It was grief. It was the death rattle of something that used to be love. In the morning, he was gone. For real this time. He didn't come home again. 2 weeks later, Claire tried to access their joint account to pay for groceries. The transaction was declined. She checked the account. Frozen. She called Mark. Her call went straight to voicemail 3 times before he finally answered. What did you do to our accounts? Protecting my assets, Mark said, his voice cold and businesslike. My attorney advised me you might try to drain accounts before the divorce is final. Don't worry, I'm covering the mortgage. You're welcome. Mark, I don't have access to any money. I don't even have a credit card anymore. You had me cancel mine 2 years ago because you said it was redundant. Sounds like a you problem, Claire. Maybe you should have thought about financial independence before you spent 5 years playing housewife. He hung up. Claire stood in the middle of their condo, his condo, she realized because her name wasn't even on the lease, and understood for the first time how thoroughly trapped she was. She had $3,800 in a savings account, the one her grandmother had left her before she died. That was it. That was her entire financial safety net. She applied for a credit card, denied. Her credit was tied to Mark's accounts, and he'd apparently already done something to tank her score. She called her old Yale roommate, Jennifer Walsh, who ran a contemporary art gallery in Manhattan. Jen, I know it's been 5 years, but I need help. I'm getting divorced and I need a job. Anything. I can start next week. Claire, honey, I wish I could help. Jennifer's voice was genuinely sympathetic. But the art world has a brutal memory. You've been completely off the radar since 2019. Your last professional credit was that semester exhibition, and that was 6 years ago. I could maybe swing you a part-time admin position, but it's only $19 an hour, and I can't do benefits until after 6 months. $19 an hour. In Manhattan, where a studio apartment costs $2,400 a month. I understand. Thanks anyway. Claire hung up and realized with perfect, crystalline clarity, she had no career, no money, and no options. Mark had been right about one thing. She'd given up everything for him. And now she had nothing. 6 weeks later, Claire sat in a Harris County courtroom and watched her life legally dissolve. The divorce hearing was a massacre. Mark's lawyer, Victor Graves, a shark in a $4,000 suit, painted Claire as a gold digger who contributed nothing to the marriage. Your Honor, Graves said, his voice smooth as oil, Mrs. Davidson, excuse me, Miss Sullivan, hasn't been employed in 5 years. She has no income, no assets in her own name, and frankly, no marketable skills relevant to today's job market. My client has been extraordinarily generous in offering a settlement of $47,000, which represents far more than her actual financial contribution to the marriage. Claire's lawyer, Ron Mitchell, a tired public defender she could barely afford, tried to argue. Your Honor, my client sacrificed a promising career to support. Sacrificed? Graves interrupted smoothly. She attended dinner parties. She arranged flowers. She played hostess. My client's colleagues have provided depositions stating that she added no material value to his professional networking. If anything, her lack of professional achievement became an embarrassment in business circles. Claire felt every eye in the courtroom judging her. She also felt nauseous. She'd been feeling nauseous for 2 weeks now, but she attributed it to stress, to the complete implosion of her life. The judge, clearly bored and ready for lunch, banged his gavel. $47,000 one-time settlement, no alimony, no further claims to marital assets. We're adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Ron pulled her aside. Look, Claire, I know this isn't what you wanted, but you didn't have a strong case. No kids, no documented abuse, no direct financial contribution. In Texas, that's not a winning combination. I gave up everything. I know, but the law doesn't care about opportunity cost. I'm sorry. He handed her his card. If you need anything else, call me. But honestly, take the money and move on. Build a new life. You're young, you'll recover. Claire sat on the courthouse steps, holding her phone with the Uber app open. $47,000. After Ron's fees and her storage unit bills and her credit card debt, she'd clear maybe $34,000. That was 7 months of rent. Maybe 8 if she was careful. Her sister Rachel's number was already pulled up on her phone. She'd have to ask to sleep on the couch. Again. 2 weeks after the divorce hearing, Claire was sleeping on Rachel's couch in Katy, surrounded by boxes labeled Claire's stuff. Rachel's 2 kids, ages 6 and 9, kept asking why Aunt Claire cried in the bathroom. The nausea had gotten worse. Claire assumed it was anxiety, stress, the complete collapse of her life manifesting physically. At 2:47 a.m., unable to sleep, Claire scrolled through high-level job boards on her laptop. Nothing. She was overqualified for retail, underqualified for executive positions, And the 5-year employment gap was poison. Then she saw it. Posted 3 hours ago on a private recruitment survey she'd bookmarked during grad school. Private collection authentication specialist. Expert knowledge required. Italian Renaissance. Dutch Golden Age. Modern forgery detection. Must pass extensive federal background check. Must sign lifetime NDA. International travel 70 to 80%. Compensation 6 figures. Non-negotiable. Substantial. Discretion absolutely paramount. It was a fantasy posting for someone with 20 years of museum experience and a Rolodex of international contacts. Claire, running on desperation and half a bottle of cheap Trader Joe's wine, wrote a cover letter anyway. She attached her Yale thesis on Caravaggio's use of tenebrism and dramatic realism. Then, on impulse, she attached the 6,000-word analysis she'd written 5 years ago about a newly discovered Vermeer that sold at Christie's for $32 million. She'd proven it was a sophisticated 1960s forgery using pigment analysis, brushstroke pattern recognition, and historical context. She'd submitted it to 3 major art journals. All had ignored it. She hit send at 3:22 a.m. and passed out on the couch. At 8:43 a.m., her phone buzzed. Be at this address today. 1 p.m., bring your passport and your Yale thesis in physical form. Come alone. Do not discuss this opportunity with anyone. This email will self-delete in 60 seconds. The address was a glass tower in downtown Houston. One of those buildings with no signage, just an address number. Claire stared at the email until it disappeared from her screen. Then she got in the shower, put on her only suit, and drove to downtown Houston with her heart pounding in her throat. The elevator required a key card provided by a silent security guard who checked Claire's ID 3 times. It rose 40 floors without stopping and opened directly into a penthouse office. The space was almost empty. A massive desk, 2 chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Houston, and a single painting on the stark white wall. A man stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, looking at the painting. Tall, silver at the temples, perfectly still. He didn't turn around. Tell me about this painting. Claire approached slowly. It was abstract expressionism, chaos and violence and beauty. Jackson Pollock style, all drips and splatters and aggressive energy. The signature in the corner, J. Pollock, 1950. She examined it for 12 minutes. He didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. Finally, she stepped back. It's a forgery. Now he turned. Damian Sterling looked at her with eyes like surgical steel. His face revealed nothing. Explain. Pollock's technique was about controlled chaos, controlled being the operative word. This is just Kate. The drip patterns are hesitant here but overly aggressive here. There's no consistency of intent, no rhythm to the violence. But that's not the definitive proof. She moved closer to the canvas. The real tell is here. This white, it's titanium white, but it's acrylic-based, not oil-based. Pollock used oil-based titanium white exclusively during this period, 1948 to 1952. Acrylic titanium white in this formulation wasn't commercially available until 1963. This was painted at least 13 years after Pollock died, probably by someone very talented who learned his technique from photographs and textbooks, not from observation. Silence. Long enough to be uncomfortable. Sterling walked to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. Send in Vance, now. 30 seconds later, a flustered man in an expensive suit rushed in, slightly out of breath. Sir? Mr. Vance, this is Mose Sullivan. She's just informed me that the Pollock you authenticated last month, the one I paid $24 million for, is a forgery. Vance laughed nervously, glancing at Claire. Sir, with all due respect, my team at Christie's ran a complete authentication. We had 3 independent experts verify. She says it's acrylic-based titanium white. Sterling's voice was flat, emotionless. Oil versus acrylic. Run a mass spectrometry analysis on the paint composition. If she's correct, or you're terminated immediately. If she's wrong, she leaves this building and we never speak again. Vance went pale. Sir, the expense of that test. I just spent $24 million on a painting that may be worthless. You're concerned about a $3,000 lab test? Vance practically ran out of the room. Sterling turned back to Claire. His expression hadn't changed. You're divorced. Your ex-husband is Mark Davidson, vice president at Goldman Sachs. He's over-leveraged personally, thinks he's significantly smarter than he actually is, and he's currently having an affair with a pharmaceutical sales representative named Amber Lee. Claire felt like she'd been slapped. How do you know all that? I don't hire people I haven't investigated, Miss Sullivan. Background checks are thorough. He tapped his desk. Your analysis of that fake Vermeer 5 years ago, the Christie's piece. You were correct. My private team reached the same conclusion, but it took them 4 months and $200,000 in lab work. It took you 1 week and access to a university library. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. I own the 4th largest private art collection in the world. Current verified value, $3.7 billion. It's infested with people like Vance. People who tell me what I want to hear instead of what I need to know. 3 months ago, I decided I needed a real authentication expert. Not a yes man, not someone protecting their reputation. Someone who tells the truth even if it costs me millions. He turned, those steel gray eyes locked on her. You start today, $875,000 annually, plus expenses. Travel, accommodation, research materials. You answer only to me. Your first assignment, audit every piece Vance has touched in the last 3 years. Find every mistake he made. Find every piece I overpaid for. Every forgery, every misattribution. He slid a contract across the desk. Sign the NDA. My driver will take you to your new apartment. It's already furnished. You leave for Florence in 4 days to examine a possible Titian. Bring your thesis research. Claire stared at the contract. Her hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't fear. Why me? She whispered. Sterling looked at her for a long moment. Because you were right about the Vermeer and nobody listened. Because you're angry. I can see it. And because anger, when properly directed, produces exceptional work. You're not here to make friends, Miss Sullivan. You're here to save me from my own bad investments. Can you do that? Claire picked up the pen. Yes. Then sign. She signed. As she stood to leave, she paused at the door. Or Sterling, what if Vance is right? What if the Pollock is real and I'm wrong? Then you'll be fired before you finish unpacking. But you're not wrong. He didn't look up from his computer. The car is waiting downstairs. Driver knows where to go. See you in Florence. The apartment Sterling's company provided was in Midtown. 2 bedrooms, furnished, with a view of downtown Houston. It was nicer than anywhere Claire had ever lived. The rent, she later discovered, was $4,000 a month. She stood in the empty living room, holding her single box of possessions, and started laughing. Hysterical, slightly unhinged laughter that turned into crying. She sank to the floor and sobbed. $875,000 a year. She'd been afraid to apply for $19 an hour jobs. And now she was making $875,000. Her phone rang. Rachel. Claire, oh my God, where are you? You left a note that said you had a job interview, but that was 6 hours ago, and I was worried. Rach, Claire's voice was shaking. I got a job, a real job. $875,000 a year. Silence. Then, Claire, that's not funny. Don't joke about. I'm not joking. I'm sitting in my new apartment. It's furnished. It has a view. I start tomorrow. Doing what? For who? I can't tell you details. I signed an NDA. But Rach, it's real. It's art authentication. It's exactly what I studied for. It's exactly what I'm good at. And someone finally noticed. Rachel started crying. Oh, honey. Oh, Claire. I'm so happy for you. You deserve this. You deserve all of this. After they hung up, Claire sat in her empty apartment and thought about Mark's face at the courthouse. The contempt. The certainty that she was worthless. She couldn't wait to prove him wrong. 2 weeks later, Claire stood in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, examining a painting that 3 skeptical Italian art historians insisted was an authentic late-period Botticelli. Lorenzo Bianchi, the lead acquisitions expert, spoke in rapid Italian to his colleagues, then switched to condescending English. Signorina Sullivan, Mr. Sterling trusts you. We do not yet have this luxury. This Botticelli has been authenticated by the Moretti Institute. They are the finest in Europe. Claire examined the painting. Madonna and Child, circa 1505. Beautiful. The gold leaf, the delicate faces, the masterful composition. She spent 40 minutes with it, used a jeweler's loupe, examined brushstrokes, studied the gold leaf application under raking light. The nausea hit her again. She excused herself to the bathroom, splashed water on her face, and returned. Finally, it's a workshop piece. Botticelli supervised, but he didn't paint it. The Italians scoffed. Bianchi looked insulted. Impossibile. The gold leaf technique is too uniform, too perfect. Claire pointed to the Madonna's veil. Botticelli had a documented tremor in his right hand starting around 1500. You can see it in the Birth of Venus, in the way the lines of Venus's hair waver microscopically. These lines are perfectly steady. This was painted by someone with perfect motor control, probably Filipino Lippi, who worked in Botticelli's studio. A beautiful piece, absolutely museum-worthy, but not by Botticelli's hand. Not at $22 million. Bianchi sputtered in Italian. Claire continued calmly. I can have a complete technical analysis done in 3 days. X-ray fluorescence, infrared reflectography, pigment analysis. Or you can accept my assessment now, your choice. Bianchi made a call, spoke rapidly in Italian, hung up, looking furious. The owner has agreed to reclassify his Botticelli workshop and reduce the price to 4 million euros. Claire nodded. That's fair value. Mr. Sterling will consider it. As they left, one of the younger Italian assistants whispered to her in English. That was, how do you say, fucking badass? 6 weeks into her new job, Claire was in Tokyo, examining a collection of ukiyo-e prints. It was 3:17 a.m. She'd been awake for 22 hours. Her eyes were red, her back ached, and the nausea was relentless. She was on a video call with Sterling, who was reviewing her authentication reports in real time. 6 of the 12 prints are forgeries, she said, her voice hoarse. 1960s reproductions. Very sophisticated. The forger understood Hokusai's technique, but the paper is wrong. Hokusai used mulberry paper with a specific fiber length and density. These are modern kozo paper. Beautiful but wrong. I ran microphotography on the fiber structure. The images are in the shared folder. Sterling reviewed the data in silence. You've been working for 18 hours straight, he said finally. I'm fine. That wasn't a question about your condition. That was an observation about your judgment. When did you last eat? I had coffee. Coffee isn't food, Miss Sullivan. I'm close to finishing. You're done for tonight. That's not a suggestion. His tone was firm but not unkind. Order room service. Charge it to the corporate account. Sleep for 8 hours. The prints will still be fake in the morning. Claire felt tears suddenly burning in her eyes. She was so tired. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Of what? That I'll stop, and when I stop, I'll wake up and realize this is all a dream, that it's not real, that I'm still on Rachel's couch. Sterling was quiet for a moment. Miss Sullivan, Claire Mirch, this is real. You've authenticated 127 pieces in 6 weeks. You've saved me $14 million on bad acquisitions. You've increased the verified value of my collection by $89 million. Those are facts. Facts don't disappear when you sleep. But what if I make a mistake? What if, then you'll make a mistake and we'll correct it. You're not infallible. You're just exceptionally competent. Now eat something and go to bed. That's an order. The call ended. Claire sat there for a moment, then realized something she'd been ignoring for weeks. She hadn't had her period in over 2 months. With everything happening, the divorce, the job hunt, the stress, the travel, she hadn't even noticed. She ordered room service. And on the way to her room's bathroom, she stopped by the hotel's convenience shop and bought 3 pregnancy tests. All 3 were positive. She sat on the bathroom floor and did the math. The timeline was clear. That last night with Mark, 4 months ago, the night they'd fallen into old patterns one final time. She was 16 weeks pregnant. She was pregnant with Mark Davidson's baby. Claire sat on that Tokyo hotel bathroom floor, holding a positive pregnancy test, and understood with perfect clarity. Her life had just become infinitely more complicated. 8 weeks into the Claire was visiting Rachel and the kids during a rare weekend back in Houston. They were sweating in Rachel's kitchen, drinking tea. Claire couldn't stomach wine anymore, while the kids slept upstairs. "You haven't told him yet, have you?" Rachel asked quietly. "Who? Mark or Sterling?" "Either of them." Claire shook her head. "What am I supposed to say? Hey, Mark, remember that last pity fuck? Congratulations, you're going to be a father. Oh, and by the way, I'm now making more money than you and working for a billionaire you're terrified of." She laughed bitterly. "Or should I tell Sterling, hey boss, I'm pregnant with my abusive ex-husband's baby. Hope that doesn't affect my $875,000 salary." "Claire, I'm not telling anyone, not yet." Claire put her hand on her still flat stomach. "I need to figure this out. I need to decide what I'm going to do." "What do you want to do?" Claire looked at her sister. "I want to keep my job. I want to keep building my career. I want to prove that I'm not the worthless person Mark said I was." She paused. "And I want this baby. Not because it's Mark's, but because it's mine." Rachel reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we'll figure it out. You're not alone." "But I am alone, Rach. I'm carrying the child of a man who destroyed me while working for a man who saved my career. And I can't tell either of them without risking everything." "So you hide it? For how long?" "As long as I can." 10 weeks into the web, Claire was at Sotheby's auction house in Geneva with Sterling, sitting in a private skybox overlooking the main auction floor. She was 20 weeks pregnant now, wearing a loose blazer that hid the small bump starting to show. Below them, the ultra-wealthy bid millions on masterpieces like it was monopoly money. "Lot 47, Sterling murmured, not looking away from the floor. "The Caravaggio. Your final assessment?" Claire had spent 3 weeks on this painting. "It's legitimate. Provenance is solid. It's been in the same family's private collection since 1780. The technique matches perfectly with his documented work from 1609. The tenebrism, the realism, the almost brutal emotional intimacy. It's absolutely Caravaggio, but, Lot 52, the Artemisia Gentileschi." Claire pulled up her analysis on her tablet. "This is more important. It's estimated at half the Caravaggio's price because the market undervalues female artists. But this painting, Judith Beheading Holofernes, painted circa 1614, this is from her mature period, after the rape trial in Rome. The power in it, the controlled violence, the way she paints Judith's face with zero mercy. It's extraordinary. And technically it's flawless. In 30 years, this will be worth 5 times what the Caravaggio is worth today. It's not just art, Mr. Sterling. It's feminist art history." Sterling considered this. Below them, the Caravaggio bidding had reached 35 million euros. "Buy both," he said. "Both, sir, that's—" "You made your case for both. You're the expert. Execute your judgment." Claire picked up the phone connected to their representative on the floor. She placed the bids. She won both paintings. Total expenditure, 71 million euros, 76.8 million US dollars. That evening, Sterling called Claire to the hotel's private restaurant for a working dinner. "You've completed your audit of the Vance acquisitions," Sterling said, reviewing his tablet. "Final count, 14 forgeries, 23 misattributions, 6 pieces worth significantly more than I paid. Net result? You've increased the verified value of my collection by $347 million in 10 weeks. Claire felt a flush of pride. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. You did the work." He closed his tablet. The board of directors for the Sterling Foundation met this afternoon. They've approved a new position, Executive Director of Acquisitions and Authentication. Salary, $1.2 million annually, plus equity in the foundation's valuation increases. The position is yours if you want it. Claire's hands started shaking. $1.2 million? Is that insufficient? No, I can't believe. You're the reason the foundation's collection increased in value by $1/3 billion in 2 months. $1.2 million is a bargain for me. He stood. Think about it. You don't need to answer tonight. Yes, Claire said immediately. Yes, I accept. Sterling nodded once. Good, we'll announce it Monday. Oh, congratulations, Miss Sullivan. That night, Claire called Rachel, crying happy tears. Rach, I did it. I actually did it. I'm executive director. I'm making $1.2 million. I'm going to be okay. What about the baby? I have health care now. Real health care. I can do this. I can have this baby and keep my career. I can do both. For the first time in months, Claire felt like she could breathe. 3 days later, everything fell apart. Claire woke up in her Houston apartment to 47 text messages and 23 missed calls. The first text was from Jennifer, her old Yale friend. Claire, I'm so sorry. I don't know who did this. Claire opened the link Jennifer sent. It was a blog post on Art World Insider, a gossipy industry website. The headline, The Mystery Woman in Sterling's Bed, How Claire Sullivan Slept Her Way to the Top. The article was vicious. It included photos of Claire at expensive restaurants, at Sotheby's standing close to Sterling, getting into Sterling's company car, and a photo from 2 weeks ago where, if you look closely, there was a slight curve to her abdomen. The text was worse. Sources close to Sterling Industries reveal that Claire Sullivan, 34, a recently divorced art expert with virtually no professional experience since 2019, has become the latest in a long line of women seeking financial security through powerful men. After a messy divorce that left her virtually penniless, Sullivan allegedly leveraged her Yale connections to seduce the reclusive billionaire Damian Sterling. Sterling has reportedly installed Sullivan in a luxury apartment, flies her internationally on private jets, and recently appointed her to a $1.2 million position, despite her having authenticated fewer than 200 pieces in her entire career. And now, sources report, Sullivan may be pregnant, though whether it's her ex-husband's or Sterling's is anyone's guess. One thing is certain, Claire Sullivan knows how to secure her future. The comments below were savage, hundreds of them. Gold digger got herself knocked up to secure the bag. Smart move, actually. Billionaire baby equals set for life. She's pretty, but is the baby Sterling's or the ex's? Taking bets. This is why women can't be taken seriously in this industry. I hope Sterling's lawyers have a good paternity clause. Claire read every single comment. Each one felt like a knife. Her phone rang. Sterling. Have you seen it? She asked, her voice shaking. Yes. I didn't. I earned this. I know. Everyone thinks and they're saying I'm pregnant with your... Are you pregnant? Yeah. His voice was calm, clinical. Claire froze. Yes. With your ex-husband's child? How did you... Timeline. You've been working for me for 10 weeks. If you were pregnant with my child, you'd be barely pregnant. The article suggests otherwise, which means conception predates your employment. Basic math, Ms. Sullivan. Claire sat down hard. I'm sorry, I should have told you. I was afraid you'd fire me. I was afraid... Ms. Sullivan. His voice cut through her panic. What matters is what you know to be true. Do you believe you slept your way into this position? No. Do you believe your pregnancy affects your competence? No. Then why are you giving strangers on the internet the power to convince you otherwise? You authenticated 340 pieces in 10 weeks. You identified 14 forgeries that 3 separate expert teams missed. You saved me $89 million and made me $347 million. Those are facts. Facts don't care about blog posts written by jealous failures. A pause. But if you're having doubts about your competence, perhaps you're right. Perhaps you should resign. Claire felt ice in her stomach. You're firing me? I'm asking if you believe what they're saying. If you do, then yes, resign, because I don't employ people who don't trust their own judgment. Your judgment is what I pay for. Claire wiped her eyes. I don't believe them. Then stop reading garbage and get back to work. The Uffizi acquisition closes in 3 days. I need your final report. And Ms. Sullivan? The announcement stands. Your promotion stands. Your pregnancy is your personal matter. Anyone who has a problem with any of it can discuss it with my legal team. Oh, and congratulations on the baby. He hung up. Claire sat on her couch holding her phone, one hand on her growing belly, and made a decision. She wasn't going to read the comments. She wasn't going to defend herself. She was going to let her work speak for itself. But the damage was done. The art world now thought she was a fraud carrying either her ex's baby or her boss's. 1 week after the blog post, Claire was in Milan examining a possible Titian when Sterling called. She was 21 weeks pregnant now, the bump undeniable beneath her loose clothing. She'd been standing in a private gallery for 3 hours, analyzing brushstrokes under magnification, when her phone vibrated. "We have a problem," Sterling said without preamble. "The Sterling Foundation Board has called an emergency meeting." Claire sat down on a velvet bench, suddenly dizzy. "About what?" "About you. The blog post has created what they're calling reputational concerns. Several board members believe your appointment damages the foundation's credibility. They're demanding I place you on administrative leave pending an investigation into your credentials. They're also raising questions about your pregnancy and whether you'll be able to fulfill your duties." Claire felt her stomach drop. The baby chose that moment to kick, a sharp flutter against her ribs. "An investigation? My credentials are public record. My Yale degree, my thesis, my publications, everything is documented. And my pregnancy doesn't affect my work. I've authenticated more pieces in 3 months than most experts do in a year. I know that, you know that. But this isn't about facts, Miss Sullivan. This is about optics. 3 board members have threatened to resign if you remain in your position. Those 3 represent $400 million in foundation commitments. They're suggesting publicly that you're either carrying your employer's child or using pregnancy as leverage to secure your position. The implication is that I hired you for reasons other than your competence. That's insane. That's defamation. We could sue? We could, but litigation would take years and generate more negative publicity. The board meets tomorrow morning, Houston time. I'll be presenting a comprehensive review of your work, your authentication record, your cost savings, your revenue generation. I'll be defending your appointment with every data point we have. But I need you to understand something, Claire. If the board votes against you, if they make this a condition of their continued funding, I may not be able to override them. The foundation's charter gives them significant authority over personnel decisions." After he hung up, Claire sat in that Milan gallery, one hand on her belly, staring at the Titian she'd been examining. The painting depicted Danae receiving Zeus in a shower of gold, a woman being possessed by a god who'd taken a form she could accept. The metaphor wasn't lost on her. She pulled out her laptop and started looking at job postings again. Museum receptionist, gallery assistant, art history tutor. Everything led back to the same problem. Employment gap, 2019 to 2024. Please explain. She was right back where she started, except now she was pregnant. 3 days later, Claire's phone rang while she was reviewing authentication reports in her Houston apartment. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Claire, it's me." Mark. His voice was cold, clipped, controlled. The voice he used when he was about to destroy someone in a business negotiation. "How did you get this number?" "I saw the article. Art World Insider. Very illuminating. You're pregnant." Claire said nothing. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, protective. "Is it mine?" "That's none of your business." "The fuck it isn't." His control shattered. "If you're carrying my child, I have legal rights, parental rights. And if it's Sterling's, Jesus Christ, Claire, did you move in that fast? Did you fuck a billionaire while we were still legally married? While the ink was still wet on our divorce papers? We were separated, Mark. You were living with Amber. That's completely different, and you know it. I didn't get pregnant. I didn't trap anyone with a baby." His voice was rising, the fury bleeding through. "I'm calling my lawyer right now. If that's my kid, I want a court-ordered paternity test. And I want a custody evaluation. I'm not letting you raise my child while you're whoring yourself out to some reclusive billionaire who's clearly taking advantage of you." Taking advantage? Mark, he hired me because I'm good at my job. He pays me $1.2 million because I've made him $347 million. That's not exploitation, that's capitalism. You expect me to believe a man like Damian Sterling hired you purely for your art expertise? You who hasn't worked in 5 years? You who couldn't even get a $19 an hour job at a gallery? Come on, Claire. Even you can't be that naive. He's using you, and when he's done, you'll be right back where you started. Except now you'll have a baby and no job and no prospects. Claire hung up. Her hands were shaking so hard she dropped the phone. She called Sterling immediately. Mark knows about the pregnancy. He's threatening paternity tests and custody battles. He's claiming I'm unfit, that I'm being exploited, that... Stop. Sterling's voice was sharp. Take a breath. Now tell me exactly what he said. Claire repeated the conversation, word for word. Her memory for dialogue was excellent. It was one of the skills that made her good at authentication, catching inconsistencies in provenance stories. Sterling was quiet for a moment. Do you want the child to be his legal responsibility? Do you want him to have parental rights, custody arrangements, decision-making authority over this child? No, God, no. I never want him near my baby. Then we need to move quickly. I'm connecting you with my personal legal team, not corporate counsel, my personal attorneys. They handle family law, custody disputes, high-conflict divorces. Don't communicate with Mark directly anymore. Everything goes through lawyers. If he calls, you don't answer. If he texts, you don't respond. If he shows up at your apartment, you call building security and the police. Understood? Yes. And Claire? He's going to escalate. This is what men like Mark do when they lose control. They try to regain it through intimidation, through legal threats, through any leverage they can find. Your pregnancy is leverage. He'll use it, but you're not alone in this fight. After Sterling hung up, Claire sat in her apartment and realized something. For 5 years, Mark had controlled the narrative. He'd controlled the money, the decisions, the social circle, the future, and she'd let him because it was easier than fighting. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She'd authenticated paintings worth hundreds of millions. She'd stood in front of skeptical European experts and proven them wrong. She'd built a career from nothing in 3 months. Mark could try to take her child, but he'd learn what the art world was learning. Claire Sullivan was not someone you underestimated twice. 1 week later, at 22 weeks pregnant, Claire received a certified letter from Yale University. She signed for it at her apartment building's front desk, her stomach sinking as she recognized the university seal. She opened it, standing right there in the lobby. Dear Ms. Sullivan, the Yale University Department of Art History has been made aware of allegations regarding your 2017 master's thesis, Caravaggio and the Performance of Violent Grace, Tenebrism as Psychological Realism. An anonymous complaint has been filed alleging that portions of your thesis contain improperly cited sources and may constitute academic plagiarism. Per university policy, we are required to investigate all such allegations. Your degree will be placed on administrative review pending the outcome of this investigation. You will be contacted by the Academic Integrity Committee within 30 days. Please note that if the allegations are substantiated, your degree may be revoked. Sincerely, Dr. Patricia Morrison, Department Chair. Claire read it 3 times, then a 4th. Her hands were shaking so badly the paper rustled. Mark. This was Mark. It had to be. He'd hired someone to comb through her thesis looking for any citation error, any paraphrase that was too close to source material, any footnote that wasn't perfectly formatted, and they'd found something, or claimed they found something, or fabricated something. Her entire career was built on that Yale degree. Every authentication she'd done was credentialed by that master's degree. If it was revoked, she wasn't just unemployed, she was a fraud. Everything she'd accomplished in the past 3 months would be retroactively invalidated. She called the university immediately, got bounced between 4 different departments, finally reached someone in the Academic Integrity Office, a board-sounding administrator named Patricia Williams. I need to know who filed the complaint against me. That information is confidential, Ms. Sullivan. My entire career is based on this degree. If it's revoked, I lose my job, I lose my credibility, I lose everything. I have a right to know who's accusing me. I understand your frustration, but university policy is very clear on this point. The investigation will take 60 to 90 days. You'll have an opportunity to respond to the specific allegations once the committee has completed their preliminary review and identified any areas of concern. 60 to 90 days, I'm pregnant. I'm due in 4 months. You're telling me my degree is in limbo until after I give birth? The timeline is standard for all academic integrity investigations. I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan, that's all I can tell you. Claire hung up and immediately started going through her thesis. She pulled it up on her laptop and began reading page by page, citation by citation. She'd been meticulous. She knew she'd been meticulous. She'd spent 3 years on that thesis, working with 2 advisors who'd checked every source, every footnote, every paraphrase. But what if she'd missed something? What if there was one citation, one sentence, one paragraph that was too close to the original source? What if some algorithm had flagged a similarity score and Mark's lawyers had weaponized it? Her phone rang. Sterling. I heard about Yale, he said. How did you already? Do you have Google Alerts set up for me? I have alerts set up for anything that might affect my foundation's reputation. The Yale investigation will become public knowledge within 48 hours. We need to get ahead of it. Mr. Sterling, I didn't plagiarize anything. I cited every source. I followed every rule. I believe you, but belief isn't evidence. My legal team is already preparing a response to Yale. We'll hire our own academic integrity experts to review your thesis. We'll document every citation, every footnote, every paraphrase. We'll build an affirmative case that your work is sound. But you should know, the board met this morning. They voted 7-4 to place you on unpaid administrative leave until the Yale investigation concludes. Unpaid. Claire felt the room tilt. How long? 60 to 90 days minimum, possibly longer if Yale drags it out. I don't have savings for 3 months with no income. I have rent. I have medical bills for the pregnancy. Your apartment is paid for by the foundation. That continues. Your health insurance continues. But the salary is suspended. I argued against it, Claire, but they have fiduciary responsibility to protect the foundation's reputation. If you're working for us while under investigation for academic fraud, it exposes us to liability. I understand, Claire said quietly. She didn't understand, but she was too tired to fight. For what it's worth, I don't believe you plagiarized anything. And when this is resolved, and it will be resolved, your position will be waiting. But right now, we're in damage control mode. After he hung up, Claire sat in her apartment that Sterling's company paid for, that she'd probably have to vacate now, and realized she was losing everything. Again, the board had turned on her. Yale had turned on her. Mark was circling like a shark, and the only person who believed in her was unconscious in a hospital bed. Her phone rang. Houston Methodist Hospital. Ms. Sullivan, this is Dr. Rebecca Okonkwo. I'm an attending physician at Houston Methodist Hospital. I'm calling about Damian Sterling. Claire's blood ran cold. What happened? Mr. Sterling was brought into our emergency department 2 hours ago. He collapsed in his office. We're still running tests, but preliminary imaging suggests either a cardiac event or an ischemic stroke. He's currently stable but unconscious. He had your contact information listed as his professional emergency notification. I wanted to inform you of his condition. Is he going to be okay? We're doing everything we can. He's in excellent hands. I'll update you as we know more. Are you family? No, I work for him. I'm his employee. I see. Well, I've made note of your contact information. We'll keep you informed. The call ended. Claire sat in her apartment completely alone and understood with perfect clarity. Every catastrophe had hit at once. She was unemployed, broke, under academic investigation, with her ex-husband threatening custody battles, and the one person who believed in her was fighting for his life in intensive care. She called Rachel. Can I come back to the couch? Rachel's voice was gentle. Of course, honey, of course. Come home. That night, Claire packed everything she owned, which still fit into 6 boxes, and loaded them into a U-Haul. She drove to Katie in silence, one hand on her belly, tears streaming down her face. The baby kicked, strong, insistent kicks, as if to say, I'm here. We're in this together. Keep going. Claire kept going. Claire spent 7 days back on Rachel's couch, 23 weeks pregnant now, visibly showing. Rachel's kids were excited about the baby, which somehow made everything worse. Their innocence, their joy, their uncomplicated happiness about a new cousin, it was a mirror held up to Claire's complete failure. She spent her days applying for jobs. Museum gift shop attendant in Austin. We regret to inform you. Gallery receptionist in Dallas. Position has been filled. Art history tutor, $15 an hour. We've decided to pursue other candidates. Nobody wanted a pregnant woman under academic investigation whose last employer put her on unpaid leave. She spent her nights obsessively reviewing her thesis, page by page, citation by citation, looking for the error that would destroy her. She found nothing. Her citations were meticulous. Her paraphrasing was careful. Her footnotes were comprehensive, which meant Mark's lawyers had either fabricated something or were banking on the investigation itself being punishment enough. The process was the punishment. On day 8, Rachel sat down next to her on the couch. It was 2 in the afternoon. Claire was still in pajamas, laptop open, reviewing her thesis for the 100th time. Claire, honey, I'm worried about you. I'm fine. You're not eating, you're not sleeping. You just sit here with your laptop. I have to find the error. If there's a citation mistake in my thesis, I need to find it before the committee does. If I can show them it was an honest mistake, maybe they won't revoke my degree. Maybe I can fix it before. Claire. Rachel took the laptop away. Stop. This isn't healthy. You're pregnant. You need to take care of yourself and the baby. My entire career is on the line. I know, but destroying yourself isn't going to save it. Rachel paused, choosing her words carefully. Have you thought about maybe this is a sign? Maybe it's time to just move on? Find a different career? Something more stable? Something that doesn't depend on a degree that's being investigated? Claire stared at her sister. Move on? Rachel, this is who I am. Art authentication is the only thing I'm good at. It's the only thing I trained for. If I lose this, I'm nothing. That's not true. Yes, it is. Mark was right. I'm nothing without this degree. Nothing without this career. I'm just a woman who wasted 5 years playing housewife, and now I'm right back where I started, except now I'm pregnant and with the child of a man who's trying to destroy me. Rachel reached across and took Claire's hand. You are not nothing. You authenticated 340 pieces in 3 months. You saved Sterling $89 million. You made him $347 million. Those numbers don't lie, Claire. You did that. Not your degree. Not Sterling, you. But if Yale revokes my degree, none of it matters. Every authentication I did becomes questionable. Every piece I approved could be challenged. The foundation could be sued. Sterling could be sued. I could have destroyed his entire collection's credibility. Then fight. But fight smart, not like this. Not tearing yourself apart looking for an error that probably doesn't exist. Mark is playing psychological warfare. He wants you broken. Don't give him that satisfaction. Claire put her hand on her belly. The baby kicked. I'm so tired, Rach. I know, honey, but you're not alone. And you're not nothing. You're my sister, and you're brilliant, and you're about to be someone's mom. That's not nothing. Claire's phone buzzed. Email from Houston Methodist Hospital. Ms. Sullivan, this is Dr. Okonkwo. Mr. Sterling regained consciousness this morning. His prognosis is good. He's asking for you. If you're able to visit, he's in room 4117. Visiting hours are 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Rachel read over her shoulder. Are you going to go? Claire wiped her eyes. His sister fired me. She told me not to contact him. So what? He's asking for you, and he's the one who signs the checks, not his sister. Claire sat there for a long moment, staring at the email. Then she stood up, grabbed her keys, and drove to Houston Methodist Hospital. The ICU was on the 4th floor. Claire had to show ID at 3 different checkpoints before they'd let her through. Apparently, Sterling had security protocols even in the hospital. She walked into room 4117 at 2:34 p.m. Sterling was in the hospital bed, connected to multiple monitors, an IV in his arm, oxygen cannula in his nose. He looked thinner, older, more human than she'd ever seen him, but his eyes were clear and sharp. Ms. Sullivan, he said, his voice hoarse but strong. You're showing. She laughed, a broken, slightly hysterical sound. You had a stroke and that's your opening line? Minor stroke, ischemic, not hemorrhagic, caught it early. They did thrombolysis. I'll make a full recovery. He adjusted the bed to sit up slightly, wincing. Margaret fired you. Yes. She had no legal authority to do that. She's not on the board of directors. She's not an officer of the foundation. She has no decision-making power over personnel. She said, I know what she said. She's protective, and she's wrong. He looked at Claire directly, those steel gray eyes holding her gaze. I'm resuming control of my affairs today. The doctors have cleared me for business decisions. Your position is reinstated effective immediately. Full back pay for the week you were terminated, plus compensation for emotional distress if you want to pursue it legally. Claire shook her head. Mr. Sterling, I appreciate it, but look at me. I'm 23 weeks pregnant with my ex-husband's baby. The art world thinks I'm a fraud who slept her way into this job. Yale is investigating me for plagiarism. Mark is threatening paternity tests and custody battles. The board voted to put me on unpaid leave. Maybe everyone's right. Maybe I should just accept that this isn't going to work and move on. Stop. His voice was sharp enough that Claire flinched. I'm going to say this once, Miss Sullivan, and I need you to listen very carefully. I've employed over 3,000 people in my 40-year career. I've worked with Nobel Prize winners, Olympic gold medalists, Fortune 500 CEOs, heads of state. You are in the top 5 most competent people I've ever hired. That's not flattery. That's not kindness. That's empirical data based on measurable outcomes. But the blog post and Yale and the blog post was written by Vance. I had my IT security team trace it. He's bitter about being terminated, and he's trying to destroy your reputation to rehabilitate his own. As for Yale, the complaint was filed by a paralegal at Mark Davidson's law firm. I have documentation. Both are harassment campaigns, not legitimate concerns about your work product. And the pregnancy? He looked at her belly, then back at her face. Is yours, not theirs, not mine. Yours. It doesn't define your competence. It doesn't change the value you've generated. It doesn't alter the fact that you're the best authentication expert I've ever employed. It's simply a biological condition that will require reasonable accommodation under federal employment law, which my company already provides and which is frankly none of the art world's business. Claire felt tears burning. Mark wants a paternity test. He wants custody evaluation. He's claiming I'm unfit, that I'm being exploited, that let him try. My legal team is already preparing a response. Mark Davidson is a convicted felon, or he will be by the time his trial concludes. He embezzled $8.4 million from his clients. He tried to steal from me. He has zero credibility and zero legal standing. But I need to know something from you, Claire. Do you want this child? Yes. Do you want to continue working for me? Yes. Then that's settled. You're reinstated immediately. The board's decision is overturned. I'm exercising my authority as founder and majority stakeholder. We'll work out a modified travel schedule for your 3rd trimester. Domestic only, no international flights after 32 weeks. And we'll arrange comprehensive maternity leave. 4 months paid with the option to extend to 6 months if needed. HR will send you a full benefits package tomorrow. Why are you doing this? Claire's voice was barely a whisper. Why are you risking your foundation's reputation, board relationships, everything, for me? Sterling looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost gentle. Because 3 years ago, Mark Davidson tried to steal from me. Small amounts, 50,000 here, 100,000 there, moved from subsidiary accounts I held at Goldman Sachs into offshore shell corporations. My forensic team investigated. They traced the irregularities back to Davidson's access codes, his authorization timestamps, his digital fingerprints all over the transactions. But we couldn't prove it definitively. The amounts were small enough to create reasonable doubt. So I moved my accounts to a different bank and flagged Davidson internally at Goldman. I made sure he'd never touch my money again. He paused, adjusting the oxygen cannula. But I couldn't prove it in court. I couldn't destroy him the way he deserved to be destroyed. And then you came along. You gave me that ledger from your marriage, that meticulous record he kept of every theft, every transaction, every crime. That ledger was the final piece my forensic team needed. Mark Davidson didn't just steal from his clients. He tried to steal from me. And I don't forgive people who steal from me. So you're helping me to get revenge on Mark? No. I'm helping you because you're an exceptionally competent employee who's being targeted by a criminal specifically because you provided evidence of his crimes. Destroying Mark Davidson is simply efficient business. He's a thief and a fraud, and he needs to be removed from the financial sector. The fact that it also helps you? That's alignment of interest, not charity. Claire wiped her eyes. What about Yale? What about the board? Yale will drop the investigation once my legal team provides them with documentation that the complaint came from a convicted felon's law firm. Academic integrity committees don't like being used as weapons in custody disputes. And the board? They serve at my pleasure. 3 of them have already called to apologize after I made it clear their funding commitments are contingent on treating my employees with basic dignity. The other 4 will fall in line or find themselves replaced. You'd replace board members for me? I'd replace board members for the principle that competent employees don't get thrown overboard at the first sign of controversy. You authenticated 340 pieces in 10 weeks with a 98% accuracy rate. The 2 pieces you flagged as questionable were later proven to be forgeries by independent labs. You have the highest accuracy rate of any expert I've employed in 20 years. Those are facts. Facts don't care about blog posts or pregnancy or Yale investigations. Facts are facts. He closed his eyes briefly, clearly exhausted. Now go home. Get some rest. You have a presentation to the board next week. You're going to walk them through every authentication you've completed, every piece of evidence you've generated, every dollar you've saved and earned for the foundation. You're going to show them exactly why they were wrong to doubt you. And then they're going to vote to make your position permanent with full benefits and equity participation. Can you do that? Yes. Then go prepare. And Ms. Sullivan? Claire, welcome back. 2 weeks later, Claire was back in her apartment, back on salary, working from home on her laptop when her phone started exploding with notifications. News alerts, text messages, emails, social media mentions. She opened the first news alert. Goldman Sachs vice president arrested in $8.4 million embezzlement scheme. Federal prosecutors allege 5-year pattern of wire fraud. There was a photo of Mark in handcuffs being led out of the Goldman Sachs tower by federal agents. His face was pale, shocked, disbelieving. This wasn't supposed to happen to him. He was Mark Davidson. He was untouchable. The article detailed everything: the shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, the offshore accounts, the systematic theft from client accounts over 5 years. The evidence provided by Sterling Industries, the cooperation of the SEC and FBI, the potential sentence, up to 20 years in federal prison. Her phone rang. Mark's mother, Barbara Davidson. Claire, you did this. You destroyed him. You're carrying his child, and you destroyed him. Mrs. Davidson, your son embezzled $8.4 million from his clients over 5 years. I didn't make him do that. I didn't force him to create shell corporations or move money into offshore accounts. He did that himself. He said you planted evidence. He said that billionaire you're working for, or sleeping with, who knows, framed him. This is revenge because he divorced you. Your son kept meticulous records of his own crimes, Mrs. Davidson. That ledger I found, he created it. He documented every transaction. That's not my fault. That's his fault for being stupid enough to write everything down. How dare you? We'll fight you for that baby. Mark has rights. He's the father. Mark has the right to remain silent, which he should probably start exercising. And as for the baby, your son is about to be a convicted felon. No court is giving him custody of anything. Goodbye, Mrs. Davidson. Claire hung up, her hands shaking, but not from fear this time, from something else, something that felt almost like power. The next 6 weeks were a blur. Mark's trial was national news. White-collar crime, a respected investment bank, a sympathetic narrative about greed and betrayal. The media loved it. Claire tried to avoid the coverage, but it was impossible. Mark's lawyers mounted an aggressive defense, claiming he'd been set up, that the evidence was fabricated, that his ex-wife and her billionaire employer had conspired to frame him out of revenge for the divorce. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Crawford, methodically destroyed every argument. He presented the ledger. He presented the offshore accounts. He presented the shell corporations. He presented testimony from Sterling Industries forensic accountants. He presented Mark's digital fingerprints all over the transactions. And then he called Claire to testify. She was 30 weeks pregnant when she took the stand. The courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras, spectators. Claire wore a navy maternity dress, professional but clearly pregnant. Her hands were folded over her belly. Mark glared at her from the defense table, looking thinner, older, desperate. David Crawford approached the witness box. "Ms. Sullivan, can you identify this notebook for the court?" "Yes, it's a ledger I found in my ex-husband's home office in 2019. "Can you describe the circumstances under which you found it?" "I was looking for a box of my old journals. Mark had put them in storage in his study. I found this notebook mixed in with my things. I didn't know what it was at first. I thought it might be one of his work notebooks." "What did your ex-husband tell you it was?" "He said it was a tax optimization strategy. He said I wouldn't understand it because I didn't have a finance background. He told me not to worry about it, that it was completely legal, just complicated." "Did you believe him?" Claire paused, choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to believe him. I was financially dependent on him. I had no income, no savings that weren't tied to his accounts. And he'd spent years telling me I wasn't smart enough to understand his work, that finance was too complex for me. So yes, I believed him. Or at least, I convinced myself to believe him because the alternative was too terrifying." "Why didn't you report it to authorities at the time?" "Because I was afraid. I had nowhere to go, no way to support myself. And because I'd been conditioned to doubt my own judgment. When you're told you're stupid often enough, you start to believe it. I thought maybe I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. Maybe it really was just a complicated tax strategy." "When did you realize it wasn't?" "After our divorce was finalized, I went to work for Sterling Industries. Mr. Sterling's forensic accountants were investigating irregularities in accounts that Goldman Sachs had managed for Sterling's subsidiary companies. They asked me if I had any financial records from my marriage to Mark Davidson. I remembered the ledger. I provided it to them, and they explained what I'd actually found, a detailed record of embezzlement spanning 5 years. David Crawford nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. No further questions." Mark's defense attorney, Marcus Riley, stood for cross-examination. He was expensive, $3,000 an hour, and he looked it. Custom suit, practiced smile, the confidence of someone who'd destroyed witnesses before. "Ms. Sullivan, you're pregnant with my client's child, is that correct?" "Yes. And yet here you are, testifying against him, trying to send the father of your unborn child to federal prison. Don't you think that's vindictive?" "No, sir. It's truthful. My pregnancy doesn't change the fact that your client stole $8.4 million from his clients over 5 years. But you're carrying his baby while working for a man who has a documented grudge against my client. Damian Sterling moved all his accounts away from Goldman Sachs 3 years ago, specifically because he suspected, without proof, that my client had done something wrong. Isn't it convenient that suddenly, 3 years later, you appear with evidence that perfectly supports Mr. Sterling's suspicions? Don't you think that's a little too convenient?" Claire looked directly at the jury. "I think what's convenient, Mr. Riley, is that your client kept such meticulous records of his crimes. I didn't create that ledger. I didn't fabricate those shell corporations. I didn't move $8.4 million into offshore accounts. Your client did all of that. I just found the evidence he was stupid enough to document. That's not vindictive. That's not a conspiracy. That's just your client being caught. But you have a motive to lie. You're angry about the divorce. You felt humiliated by my client." "I was humiliated by your client, Mr. Riley. He mocked me in public, destroyed my credit, froze my accounts, left me homeless and unemployed. But that didn't make me lie. That made me finally see him clearly. For 5 years, I convinced myself he was a good man who made mistakes. And then I realized He's not a good man who made mistakes. He's a criminal who got caught. My feelings about him are irrelevant. The evidence speaks for itself. No further questions, Riley said, sitting down hard. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Guilty on all 8 counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced Mark Davidson to 12 years in federal prison with a recommendation for no early parole. As Mark was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he stopped in front of Claire. She was standing in the gallery, one hand on her belly. The baby was kicking, strong, insistent kicks. "You're really going to raise my kid while I'm in prison?" His voice was hollow, defeated. Claire met his eyes. "I'm going to raise my child. You're just a sperm donor now. That's all you'll ever be." "I'll fight you. When I get out, I'll fight you for custody. I have rights." "You'll be a convicted felon, Mark. You'll have no rights, but good luck trying. You'll be a 50-year-old ex-con with no money, no career, and no credibility. And I'll be a museum director with a multi-million-dollar salary in full custody of a child you never wanted in the first place. Which one of us do you think the court will choose?" The marshals pulled him away. He looked back once, his face twisted with rage and regret, and then he was gone. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Claire. "Miss Sullivan? Miss Sullivan, how do you feel about the verdict?" She pushed through them without answering and got into a waiting car. Not Sterling's Bugatti, just a standard black sedan from the company. Inside, she finally let herself feel something. But it wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was just quiet, like a storm that had finally passed, like a chapter that had finally closed. Her phone buzzed at Sterling. "Well done. Take tomorrow off. You've earned it." She typed back, "I don't feel like I won anything." His response, "You survived. That's different from winning. But it's more important." 2 weeks after the verdict, at 32 weeks pregnant, Claire was in Florence, her last international trip before the baby came, when Sterling called. Mark's legal team filed an appeal. They're claiming witness tampering and evidence fabrication. They're alleging that I bribed you to provide false testimony and that I manufactured evidence to frame Mark. They're also demanding a court-ordered paternity test before the baby is born. They want to prove the baby is mine, not Mark's, to support their conspiracy theory that we're romantically involved, and this is all an elaborate revenge plot. Claire sat down hard on the hotel bed. Can they do that? Can they force me to have a prenatal paternity test? They can try. Prenatal paternity tests require either amniocentesis or chorionic villus sampling, both of which carry small but real risks of miscarriage. My lawyers will fight it on the grounds that it's medically unnecessary harassment of a pregnant woman. But Claire, you need to be prepared. This is going to get much uglier before it gets better. They're going to subpoena everything: your emails, your phone records, your medical records, your travel records. They're going to try to find any evidence that you and I have an inappropriate relationship. They're going to interview hotel staff, restaurant staff, anyone who's seen us together. They're going to try to turn your pregnancy into proof of conspiracy. But there's nothing to find. We're not, I know that, you know that, but they're going to try to manufacture something anyway. They're going to take innocent interactions and recontextualize them. They're going to take professional dinners and call them dates. They're going to take business travel and call it romantic getaways. They're going to weaponize your pregnancy and your professional success to create a narrative that discredits both of us. What do? We cooperate fully. We provide every record, every receipt, every email. We let them investigate, and we let them find nothing, because there is nothing. And when they find nothing, the appeal will fail, the verdict will stand, and Mark will go to prison for 12 years. But the next few months are going to be extremely unpleasant. For the next 4 weeks, as Claire entered the final stretch of her pregnancy, Mark's legal team launched a full investigation. They subpoenaed email correspondence, phone records, travel itineraries, financial statements. They interviewed hotel staff in Florence, Tokyo, Geneva. They interviewed restaurant managers, museum curators, auction house representatives. The art world blogs had a field day. Whose baby is it? The Sterling Sullivan Davidson triangle. Pregnant art expert testified against baby's father. Or is Sterling the real father? Billionaire's revenge plot. Did Sterling frame Mark Davidson? Claire stopped reading. She focused on her work. She could still work from home, still authenticate pieces remotely using high-resolution imaging and documentation. She focused on preparing for the baby. She focused on survival. Then, 6 weeks after the appeal was filed, Sterling called with news. It's over. What? Mark's lawyer made a catastrophic error. In their discovery request, they subpoenaed my personal financial records to prove I paid you beyond your stated salary. What they found instead was a $2.3 million payment to a law firm in the Cayman Islands, paid by one of Mark's shell corporations, dated 3 weeks before his trial began. What does that mean? It means Mark tried to bribe his own lawyer's investigator to fabricate evidence against you and me. The payment was traced through the same offshore accounts he used for his embezzlement. The lawyer has been disbarred. Mark is now facing additional federal charges of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. The appeal has been withdrawn. The verdict stands, and the paternity test demand thrown out. The judge ruled it's medically unnecessary harassment of a pregnant woman with no evidentiary basis. Claire couldn't speak. She just held the phone, one hand on her belly, breathing. Claire, are you there? It's really over? Yes, the Yale investigation was also dropped this morning. Their academic integrity committee determined the complaint was filed in bad faith as part of a custody dispute and found no evidence of plagiarism in your thesis. Your degree stands, your credentials stand, your reputation stands. It's over. Claire sat down on the floor of her Florence hotel room and cried. Not from sadness, not from relief, just from exhaustion. From 2 years of fighting and falling and getting back up. Thank you, she whispered. You did this, not me. You survived. You fought back. You didn't let them break you. That's all you, Claire. Now go home. Have your baby. Take your maternity leave. And when you're ready, come back to work. We have museums to build. 1 year after that courthouse scene, Claire stood in the 3-story atrium of the Sterling Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was 35 years old now, 8 months postpartum, wearing a floor-length navy gown that actually fit again after months of breastfeeding and recovery. Her daughter, Artemisia Grace Sullivan, was with Rachel tonight. The Sterling Wing was opening to the public tomorrow, but tonight was the private gala. The art world elite had turned out in force. Museum directors, collectors, critics, philanthropists, board members, curators, everyone who mattered in the art authentication world was here. And they were all looking at her. Claire had spent the past year building this, working through her pregnancy, taking 4 months of maternity leave, then coming back to finish what she'd started. The Sterling Wing was her vision, her curation, her authentication work. Every piece in this 3-story atrium had been verified by her, analyzed by her, contextualized by her. She'd proven herself 10 times over, published papers, given lectures, joined advisory boards, but tonight still felt like a test. The art world had whispered about her for months. The pregnant mistress, the gold digger, the fraud, and now she had to face them all. Sterling appeared beside her, recovered fully from his stroke. He looked exactly as he had that first day, silver at the temples, charcoal suit, steel gray eyes. You look nervous. I am nervous. Why, Bea? You've proven yourself beyond any reasonable doubt. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam published a paper last month reattributing 3 of their Rembrandts based on your authentication methodology. The Uffizi hired you as a permanent consultant. The Getty wants you on their advisory board. You're not a scandal anymore, Ms. Sullivan. You're a museum director who happened to have a baby while revolutionizing authentication standards. In that order. They'll still be looking at me and thinking about the trial, the pregnancy, the blog posts, the whispers. Let them look, let them whisper. Your work speaks louder than their gossip ever could. Now stop worrying and go prepare for your speech. You're being introduced in 10 minutes. Claire was reviewing her notes near the bar when she saw him across the room. Mark Davidson, in a suit that didn't fit quite right anymore. released on early parole after serving only 9 months due to prison overcrowding and good behavior. She'd been notified by the prosecutor's office, but she hadn't expected him to be here. He approached slowly, hands in pockets, trying to look casual, but she could see the desperation in his eyes, the defeat in his shoulders. He wasn't Mark Davidson, Goldman Sachs vice president anymore. He was Mark Davidson, convicted felon, struggling to rebuild a life from rubble. Claire, she turned to face him fully. Mark, you shouldn't be here. I know, I wasn't invited, but I needed to see you, to talk to you. He glanced around nervously, aware of the eyes on them. Can we go somewhere private? No. Please, just 5 minutes. I've been in therapy. I've been working on myself. I've been trying to understand what I did, why I did it. I need to apologize to you properly. Not through lawyers, face to face. Claire studied him. He looked sincere, broken, almost pathetic. This was not the man who'd mocked her on courthouse steps. This was someone who'd been destroyed and was trying to find pieces to put back together. You have 3 minutes, right here. Say what you need to say. Mark took a breath. I was wrong about everything. About you, about what you were capable of, about how I treated you during our marriage. I spent 5 years systematically destroying your confidence, diminishing your achievements, making you feel worthless. And I did it deliberately. Not because you deserved it, but because I was terrified. Terrified of what? Of you, of how brilliant you actually are. I always knew, that if you ever realized your own worth, you'd leave me. So I worked very hard to make sure you never realized it. I kept you small, kept you dependent, kept you convinced that you needed me. Because the truth is, I needed you. You made me look good. You made me feel important. You were proof that I'd succeeded, that I'd won at life. And when you started to question that, when you found out about Amber, I panicked. So I destroyed you preemptively. I took everything from you so you'd be too broken to fight back. And now? Claire's voice was carefully neutral. And now I've lost everything. My career, my freedom, my reputation, my money. I'm a convicted felon working as a junior accountant making $40,000 a year. I'm living in a studio apartment in Denver. I'm 40 years old and I'm starting over with nothing. He laughed bitterly. The irony is I did to myself what I tried to do to you. I destroyed my own life thinking I was protecting it. Are you here to ask for forgiveness? No, I don't deserve forgiveness. I'm here to tell you that I see you now. I see what you accomplished while carrying my child. I see that you built an empire while I was in prison. I see that you became everything I was afraid you'd become. And I'm here to say you were always that person. I just spent 5 years convincing you that you weren't. Claire felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, but maybe understanding. Are you here to try to see Artemisia? His face twisted with pain. Is that her name? Artemisia? Yes. After the painting, the Gentileschi, the one you bought in Geneva. He smiled sadly. You named our daughter after a feminist painter who got revenge on her rapist. That's actually perfect. She's not our daughter, Mark. She's mine. You signed away parental rights as part of your plea deal. You made that choice. I know, I had to. It was that or 30 years in prison. But I thought, maybe someday when she's older, if she wants to know who her father is, maybe, if she asks, if she wants to meet you, but that's her choice, not yours. And not for a very long time. She's going to grow up knowing that her mother was told she was worthless and proved everyone wrong. She's going to grow up strong and confident and unbreakable. And she's never going to doubt her own worth the way I did. That's what I'm giving her. Not you, not your money, not your name. Just the absolute certainty that she's enough exactly as she is. I destroyed everything, didn't I? Yes, but not because you divorced me. Not because you fell in love with someone else. You destroyed everything because you couldn't handle the idea that I might be worth something without you. You destroyed everything because my success felt like your failure. And that says everything about you and nothing about me. Mark nodded slowly. I know. And I spent 5 years making you small because I was terrified of how big you actually were. And now you're here running a museum wing, and he gestured at himself, at the ill-fitting suit, at the defeated posture. I'm nothing. No, you're just not everything. Claire's voice softened slightly. I hope you find something, Mark. Some small piece of peace, some way to live with what you did. But you're not going to find it with me or Artemisia. We're done. Truly, completely done. For real this time. I know. He turned to leave, then paused. She's lucky, Artemisia, to have you as a mom. I know, Claire said simply. He walked away, shoulders slumped, disappearing into the crowd of beautiful people who would never accept him again. 20 minutes later, Claire stood at the podium. The room quieted. Hundreds of faces turned toward her. Critics who'd written her off, collectors who'd whispered about her, museum directors who doubted her credentials. She looked at them all and began to speak. Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. The Sterling Wing represents 2 years of intensive work. But really, it represents something much older and more fundamental. The idea that art isn't about ownership or possession. It's about truth. It's about preservation. It's about the stories we tell and the stories we've forgotten to tell. She paused, finding her rhythm, feeling the words settle into place. 2 years ago, I was told I was worthless, that my education was a waste, that I had contributed nothing of value to the world. And for a while, for too long, I believed it. I made myself smaller and smaller, trying to fit into someone else's definition of success, someone else's idea of what I should be. But art doesn't let you hide. It doesn't let you pretend. It demands precision, demands honesty, demands that you trust your own eyes and your own judgment, especially when no one else does. She gestured to the Rembrandt behind her, the centerpiece of the collection. This painting was lost for 200 years, misattributed, forgotten, stored in a private collection where no one could see it or study it or appreciate it. And then we found it. We authenticated it. We brought it back into the light, because that's what we do here. We find the truth that's been hidden. We restore the stories that have been erased. She walked toward the Artemisia Gentileschi painting on the opposite wall, Judith beheading Holofernes, the painting she'd insisted Sterling buy in Geneva. This painting was attributed to Artemisia Gentileschi's father for 300 years, 3 centuries, because the world couldn't imagine, couldn't accept, that a woman could paint with such power, such controlled violence, such unflinching honesty. So they erased her. They gave her work to a man. They wrote her out of history. Her voice strengthened, filling the atrium. But the truth didn't disappear. It was always there in the brushstrokes, in the composition, in the way Judith's face shows absolutely zero mercy as she saves her people by killing the man who threatened them. You can't erase truth. You can hide it. You can misattribute it. You can try to paint over it. But it's always there underneath the lies, waiting to be found by someone who knows how to look. She stepped back toward the podium. Tonight, we open the Sterling Wing, not as a monument to wealth or power or individual achievement. We open it as a commitment to truth. To the women like Artemisia, whose work was stolen and given to men. To the artists who were erased because they didn't fit someone's narrow definition of genius. To everyone who was told they were nothing and had to prove they were everything. This wing is for you. This work is for you because your stories matter. Your truth matters. And no one gets to tell you otherwise. She paused one final time. Thank you. The applause started slowly, then built, then became thunderous. It rolled through the atrium like a wave, sustained and genuine and overwhelming. People stood, critics who'd dismissed her, museum directors who'd doubted her, board members who'd voted to fire her. They were all standing now, applauding. Claire stepped down from the podium and was immediately surrounded by people wanting to congratulate her, to ask her questions, to invite her to speak at their institutions. She handled them all with grace and confidence she'd earned the hard way. Later that night at 11:47 p.m., the gala was winding down. Most of the guests had left. The caterers were cleaning up. The museum was slowly emptying. Claire stood alone in front of the Artemisia Gentileschi painting, studying it the way she always did when she needed to think. Judith, sword raised, in the act of delivering justice. Not revenge, justice. There was a difference. Sterling approached silently, standing beside her without speaking for a long moment. The board finalized your new contract today, he said finally. Director of the Sterling Foundation. $1.8 million annually, full equity stake in the foundation's growth, comprehensive benefits package, including childcare stipend and flexible scheduling. You start after you take a mandatory 1-month vacation. Claire smiled. You're ordering me to take a vacation? You haven't stopped working in 2 years. You built this wing while pregnant, on trial, under investigation, and postpartum. Take a month, go to Florence, take Artemisia. Look at paintings without analyzing them. Remember why you fell in love with art in the first place. I don't know if I remember how to do that. Then it's time to learn. He turned to leave, then paused. You asked me once why I hired you. I told you it was because you were right about the Vermeer and nobody listened. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Claire turned to look at him. I hired you because I saw someone who had been systematically destroyed by someone who was supposed to love them. And I've seen what that does to people. Most of them never recover. They carry that worthlessness with them forever, like a weight they can't put down. But you were angry. And anger, when properly directed, is the most powerful fuel in the world. I knew if I gave you a chance, you'd use that anger to become extraordinary. And you did. Thank you, Claire said softly. Don't thank me. You did all of it. I just didn't get in your way. He nodded once. Congratulations, Director Sullivan. Now go home to your daughter. He walked away into the emptying museum. Claire turned back to the painting one last time. She pulled out her phone and looked at the photo Rachel had sent. Artemisia asleep in her crib, one tiny fist curled near her face. Peaceful, imperfect, and hers. Claire thought about the past 2 years, the courthouse steps, the pregnancy test in Tokyo, the trial, the catastrophes, the rebuild. She thought about Mark in Denver, trying to find redemption he might never fully achieve. She thought about her daughter, who would grow up knowing her mother was brilliant and unbreakable. And she realized this was victory. Not revenge, not destruction, just the simple, powerful fact of her own existence, her own worth, her own life, built from nothing, twice. She was 35 years old, director of a $4.8 billion art foundation, published scholar, advisory board member for 3 major museums, mother, financially independent, and happy. Finally, truly happy. She walked out of the Sterling wing into the New York night, alone and smiling, ready for whatever came next. Because Claire Sullivan finally understood the truth that had been painted into every canvas she'd ever authenticated. You can't erase truth. You can hide it, deny it, try to paint over it, but it's always there waiting to be found, and she'd found hers.